Captain Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the UES Defiant, watching the massive alien fleet position itself around Earth's orbital stations. 300 ships from the Galactic Confederation hung like predatory birds in the black void, their crystalline hulls gleaming with an otherworldly luminescence that made her skin crawl. "Ma'am, incoming transmission from the flagship," Communications Officer Torres reported, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. The entire bridge crew had been walking on eggshells for the past 6 hours since the alien fleet had dropped out of hyperspace without warning. Sarah nodded, straightening her uniform jacket. "Put it through full display." The main view screen flickered to life, revealing a towering figure that seemed to be carved from living marble. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire stood nearly 8 feet tall, his 4 arms crossed in what Sarah had learned was a gesture of supreme authority among his species. His elongated skull bore intricate tattoos that marked his rank, and his 6 eyes regarded her with the cold calculation of a being who had never been told no in his 3-century lifespan. "Primitive human," Kethvar's voice resonated through the bridge's speakers with the weight of absolute certainty. "I am Ambassador Kethvar, speaking for the Galactic Confederation Council. Your species has been found guilty of 17 violations of galactic maritime law, 43 breaches of territorial expansion protocols, and 612 infractions against the Universal Code of Civilized Conduct." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Behind her, she could hear the subtle shift in her crew's breathing patterns, the way they always did when preparing for combat. These were veterans of the Martian Independence War, the Europa mining conflicts, and a dozen smaller skirmishes that had forged humanity into something the galaxy wasn't prepared for. "The most egregious of these violations," Kethvar continued, his tone suggesting he was reading from a particularly boring grocery list, "is your species' refusal to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Confederation and submit to proper registration and taxation as a Class 7 developing species. Your expansion into 12 star systems without proper permits, your establishment of mining operations on protected worlds, and your complete disregard for our clearly transmitted warnings have left the Council no choice." The alien ambassador paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Around Earth, his fleet began to move into a more aggressive formation, weapons ports glowing with barely contained energy. "Earth is hereby placed under Confederation oversight. You will surrender all military vessels, dismantle your off-world colonies, and prepare to accept a galactic governor who will ensure your species learns to follow proper civilized protocols. Any resistance will be met with the full force of Confederation justice, which I assure you, primitive human, is both swift and absolute." Sarah looked around her bridge at faces she'd served with for over a decade. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez at Weapons Control, whose family had died when the Centauri pirates hit the transport convoy. Chief Engineer Nakamura, who had jury-rigged their engines to run at 150% capacity during the siege of Titan Station. Dr. Martinez, who had saved half the crew when they'd been exposed to Europan plague spores. These weren't just her officers. They were her family, and they represented something the Galactic Confederation had never encountered before. Humans who had clawed their way out of a gravity well through sheer stubborn determination, who had learned to survive in the hostile emptiness of space, not through superior technology or ancient wisdom, but through pure human ingenuity and an absolute refusal to give up. A slow smile spread across Sarah's face, the kind of smile that had made pirate captains surrender without firing a shot and caused hardened Marines to request transfers to other units. It was the smile of someone who had spent their entire career being underestimated by beings who thought they knew better. "That's very interesting, Ambassador," she said, her voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Kethvar's 6 eyes narrowed, clearly not accustomed to anything other than immediate capitulation. "There is no misunderstanding, Primitive. The law is clear, and your compliance is not optional." Sarah's smile widened. "Oh, I'm sure your law is very clear. The thing is, Ambassador, we have our own laws. And, according to Section 12 of the Terran Colonial Defense Act, Article 7 of the Human Rights Charter, and Subsection 4 Alpha of the Sol System Sovereignty Decree, what you're doing right now is called an act of war." The bridge fell silent except for the gentle hum of the ship's systems. Even the alien fleet seemed to pause in their positioning, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "Your laws are irrelevant," Kethvar finally responded, but there was something different in his voice now, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "The Confederation has maintained order in this galaxy for over 10,000 years. No species defies our authority." Sarah stepped forward, placing her hands behind her back in a parade rest position that somehow managed to look more threatening than any weapon. "Ambassador, let me explain something about humans that your intelligence reports probably missed. We're the species that looked at a ball of fire 93 million miles away and decided we could harness its power. We're the ones who saw an airless rock orbiting our planet and decided to plant a flag on it. When we encountered pirates in the outer systems, we didn't call for help. We built bigger guns." She gestured toward the view screen, where Earth hung like a blue marble against the star field. "You see that planet? Every single one of the 8 billion humans down there is descended from survivors. Survivors of ice ages, plagues, wars, famines, and disasters that would have wiped out most species. We didn't just survive them, Ambassador. We thrived because of them." The alien's posture shifted slightly, a subtle change that Sarah's experienced eye caught immediately. Doubt. It was the first crack in his absolute certainty. "Your threats do not intimidate the Confederation," Kethvar declared, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You have one primitive world and a handful of ships. We have conquered 1,000 systems." Sarah's laugh was genuine, filled with the dark humor that had gotten her through 20 years of impossible missions. "See, that's where you made your first mistake, Ambassador. You assumed we were just one world." She gestured to her communications officer. "Torres, patch me through to the fleet." "All channels open, Captain," Torres replied, his fingers dancing across his console with practiced efficiency. "This is Captain Shun to all Sol Defense Force vessels, all Colonial Marine units, all independent trade union ships, and all civilian vessels in the system. We have a situation that requires the galaxy to understand something very important about humanity." Across the system, dozens of ships began to move. Not just military vessels, but civilian transports, mining ships, research vessels, and even private yachts. Each one broadcasting the same message in their movement. "Not today. You want to know what makes humans different from every other species you've conquered, Ambassador?" Sarah asked, turning back to the view screen. "We don't just follow orders. We don't just accept that something is impossible because someone with a bigger ship says so. When someone tells us we can't do something, we take it as a personal challenge." The defiance sensors began picking up energy signatures from across the system as human vessels powered up weapons that weren't supposed to exist, shielding technology that had been developed in secret, and engines that could push the laws of physics to their breaking point. "So here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a battle she was determined to win. "You're going to take your fleet and return to whatever perfect little corner of the galaxy you came from. You're going to tell your Galactic Confederation that humanity appreciates their concern, but politely declines their offer of governance." She leaned forward slightly, her smile becoming something that would have made a predatory animal nervous. "And if you decide that's not acceptable, then you're going to learn why humans are the only species that domesticated wolves, climbed mountains just because they were there, and built civilizations on every piece of rock we could find in our solar system." The silence that followed was deafening. The silence stretched for exactly 17 seconds before Ambassador Kethvar's composure cracked like ice on a frozen lake. His forearms gestured sharply, and every human who had studied Zephyrian body language knew what that meant: complete and utter outrage at the audacity of an inferior species. "You dare threaten the Confederation?" His voice had lost all pretense of diplomatic courtesy, revealing the iron-hard authority that had bent 1,000 species to his will. "Your pathetic collection of primitive vessels against the combined might of 300 warships? This is suicide born of ignorance." Captain Shun felt the familiar calm that settled over her during combat situations. Time seemed to slow, her mind processing tactical information with the crystalline clarity that had kept her alive through dozens of impossible situations. Around her, The bridge crew moved with the fluid precision of a symphony orchestra, each member knowing their part without needing instruction. Weapons status, she called out without taking her eyes off the alien ambassador. All forward batteries charged and ready, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez reported. Torpedo bays loaded with full spreads. New experimental railguns are online and functioning at optimal parameters. Sarah nodded. The railguns were humanity's latest addition to their arsenal, weapons that used magnetic acceleration to launch projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. The Confederation's intelligence reports wouldn't know about them because they'd been developed in the hidden shipyards of the asteroid belt, built by engineers who understood that survival meant staying ahead of any potential threat. Communications, get me Admiral Harrison on the Lexington. Channel open, Captain. Admiral Marcus Harrison's weathered face appeared on a secondary screen, his gray eyes holding the steady confidence of a man who had outfought pirate fleets with jury-rigged equipment and sheer tactical brilliance. Behind him, the bridge of the flagship buzzed with controlled activity. Sarah, I've been monitoring your conversation with our uninvited guests, Harrison said, his voice carrying the slight drawl that marked him as a product of the Mars colonies. Thought you might want to know that our friends out there are positioning for what looks like a standard intimidation formation. Classic Confederation tactics, according to the intelligence files we've managed to acquire over the years. Sarah smiled grimly. Human intelligence operations had been active in Confederation space for over a decade, using the galaxy's complete dismissal of their capabilities as perfect cover. Traders, explorers, and survey teams had mapped Confederation ship movements, studied their tactics, and identified weaknesses that no one had bothered to exploit because no species had ever been desperate or crazy enough to try. Any word from the outer system assets? She asked. Ceres base reports all defensive platforms are online and ready. The Titan shipyards have launched their entire defensive squadron, including those prototype ships engineering has been working on. And Sarah? Harrison paused, his expression shifting to something that might have been pride. The Jupiter cloud miners have volunteered to run interference patterns. All 47 ships. The cloud mining ships were massive, ungainly vessels designed to harvest atmospheric gases from the giant planet's upper atmosphere. They were also tough as recycled steel and completely expendable in the minds of their crews, who had volunteered to use their ships as mobile shields for the more fragile combat vessels. Ambassador Kethvar had been listening to this exchange with growing incredulity. Admiral, Captain, do you primitives seriously believe your crude military hierarchy can challenge the authority of beings who have mastered faster-than-light travel for millennia? Sarah turned back to the main view screen, where the alien's 6 eyes blazed with what she was beginning to recognize as a mixture of anger and genuine confusion. The Confederation had clearly never encountered a species that didn't immediately recognize their technological superiority and submit accordingly. You know what, Ambassador? You're absolutely right about one thing. You do have superior technology. Your ships are faster, your weapons are more powerful, and you've had thousands of years to perfect the art of making other species kneel. She gestured toward her tactical display, where the positions of both fleets were represented as glowing dots against the three-dimensional map of the Sol system. But there's something you don't understand about humans, something that makes all that technology irrelevant. And what laughable delusion is that? Kethvar demanded. We don't fight fair. The words had barely left her mouth when the first phase of the human plan activated. Every piece of space debris larger than a basketball in Earth's orbital vicinity suddenly lit up with thruster signatures. What the Confederation sensors had dismissed as harmless junk revealed itself as a network of automated weapons platforms, each one broadcasting targeting data to the others in a web of coordinated fire control. Simultaneously, energy signatures began appearing throughout the asteroid belt as hidden bases powered up weapons that had been concealed for years. Mining stations that should have been defenseless revealed themselves as heavily armed fortresses. Research outposts activated shield generators that created overlapping protective fields across the most vital shipping routes. Impossible, Kethvar breathed, his 6 eyes widening as his fleet's sensors began reporting contact after contact that hadn't existed moments before. Our surveys showed no significant military installations beyond your primary worlds. Captain Chin's smile became genuinely warm, the expression of someone sharing a particularly satisfying joke. That's because you were looking for military installations. We built defensive positions that looked like everything except what they actually were. The mining station at asteroid 2847b? That's actually a fortress with enough firepower to gut a dreadnought. The agricultural research facility on Europa? It's been manufacturing guided missiles for the past 3 years. She gestured to her tactical officer, who highlighted specific points throughout the system. The weather monitoring satellites around Jupiter are actually sensor platforms that have been tracking every ship movement in Confederation space for the past 18 months. The deep space communication arrays are railgun platforms with enough range to hit targets in the outer system, and those civilian transports that have been running supplies to our outer colonies. On the main display, dozens of seemingly harmless cargo vessels began deploying weapon systems that transformed them into makeshift warships. Their civilian hulls fell away like discarded clothing, revealing the military-grade armor and weapons that had been hidden beneath. They're Q-ships, Ambassador. Armed merchants that look harmless until someone threatens their cargo, their crew, or their freedom. The Confederation fleet began to shift formation, their earlier confidence evaporating as they found themselves surrounded by a defensive network that had materialized out of seemingly empty space. What should have been a simple demonstration of overwhelming force had become a complex tactical situation where their numerical advantage was negated by the humans' preparation and positioning. This is treachery, Kethvar snarled, his 4 arms gesturing wildly. You have violated every principle of civilized warfare. Hidden weapons, disguised military vessels, fortifications that masquerade as civilian installations. No honorable species fights with such deception. Sarah's expression hardened, the warmth disappearing from her voice like heat from a depressurized compartment. You want to talk about honor, Ambassador? Your species shows up in our solar system without invitation, points weapons at our homeworld, and demands we surrender our freedom to an organization we never asked to join. You threaten our families, our colonies, our right to exist as an independent species. She stepped closer to the view screen, her voice dropping to the level tone that every veteran recognized as the sound of barely controlled fury. You call us primitive and uncivilized, but we're not the ones who traveled across interstellar space to threaten children because their parents had the audacity to build something without asking permission first. Around her, the bridge crew worked with the focused intensity of professionals who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether humanity remained free or became another footnote in the Confederation's catalog of conquered species. So no, Ambassador, we don't fight with honor. We fight to win. And when someone threatens our freedom, we fight with every advantage we can create, every weapon we can build, and every dirty trick we can devise. The tactical display showed the Confederation fleet now completely surrounded, their formations disrupted by the sudden appearance of threats they hadn't anticipated. For the first time in centuries, a Galactic Confederation force found itself in a position of tactical disadvantage against a supposedly primitive species. What happens next, Sarah continued, depends entirely on how attached you are to your ships and your crews. Because, Ambassador, you're about to learn something that every pirate, warlord, and aggressor in human space has learned the hard way. Her smile returned, but it was the cold expression of a predator that had chosen its prey. We might be primitive, but we're very, very good at breaking things that threaten us. The standoff lasted for 43 minutes and 16 seconds, during which the entire Sol system held its collective breath. Across Earth, 8 billion humans watched the news feeds with the kind of quiet determination that had once built pyramids and later sent their species to the stars. In the orbital stations, children pressed their faces against viewing ports while their parents checked emergency supplies. On Mars, the colonial government activated defense protocols that hadn't been tested since the Independence War. Ambassador Kethvar's massive form remained motionless on the view screen, his 6 eyes calculating odds that weren't adding up the way they should. 300 Confederation warships should have been more than sufficient to cow any primitive species into submission. But the tactical situation had evolved into something his military advisors were describing in terms he didn't like hearing. Status report, he commanded, his voice cutting through the bridge noise of his flagship. Fleet Commander Zarthek, a veteran of 12 conquest campaigns, approached with the measured steps of someone delivering bad news to a superior who wasn't accustomed to hearing it. His species, the hegemony, were natural warriors whose four-armed physiology and predatory instincts had made them the Confederation's preferred military commanders for over a millennium. Ambassador, our tactical analysis has identified several concerning developments, Zarthek began, his warrior's honesty preventing him from softening the facts. The humans have somehow concealed approximately 40% more military assets than our intelligence indicated. Their defensive network includes overlapping fields of fire that would make a direct assault extremely costly. Kethvar's elongated skull turned toward his military commander with the slow deliberation of a being whose authority had never been questioned. Define costly. Preliminary estimates suggest we could expect to lose between 30 and 40% of our fleet in the initial assault phase. The hidden weapons platforms are positioned to create crossfire patterns that would force us to engage multiple targets simultaneously while advancing through prepared defensive positions. The ambassador's four arms gestured in the configuration that indicated supreme displeasure. Unacceptable. The Confederation does not accept casualties against primitive species. What are our alternatives? Zarthek hesitated for a moment, his predatory instincts warning him that his next words might not be well received. Sir, the humans appear to have studied our standard tactics extensively. Their defensive positioning specifically counters our normal formation approaches. They've also deployed their civilian vessels in ways that complicate target identification and prioritization. On the view screen, Captain Chen watched this exchange with the patient attention of someone who had spent years learning to read alien body language. The subtle shifts in posture, the way Kethvar's hands moved, the increasingly tense stance of the military commander all told her that the Confederation was beginning to realize they had walked into a situation they weren't prepared for. Captain, Chief Engineer Nakamura called from his station. I'm reading energy fluctuations in their fleet formation. Looks like they're trying to reconfigure for a more aggressive approach. Sarah nodded, then activated her communication system to broadcast on all human military frequencies. All vessels, all stations, all defensive platforms. This is Captain Chen. Commence Operation Human Shield. Throughout the Sol system, the response was immediate and coordinated. Every civilian transport, mining vessel, research ship, and private yacht began moving into positions that placed them between Earth and the Confederation fleet. Not as shields for the military vessels, but as a living demonstration of what the aliens would have to do to carry out their threats. The Hegemony War Council aboard Kethvar's flagship watched in growing horror as their tactical displays showed hundreds of obviously civilian vessels placing themselves directly in the path of any potential assault. Cargo ships carrying families to the outer colonies, research vessels with university students aboard, even small private craft with children visible through their transparent aluminum viewports. By the void, Fleet Commander Zarthek whispered, his warriors' code struggling to process what he was seeing. They're using their own civilians as tactical assets. Captain Chen's voice carried clearly across the communication channel as she addressed the Confederation fleet directly. Ambassador, I want to make sure you understand what you're looking at. Every single one of those ships contains human beings who chose to put themselves between your weapons and their homeworld. Not because we ordered them to, but because that's what humans do when someone threatens their family. She gestured toward her tactical display, where the positions of the civilian vessels created a complex pattern that would make any attack devastating to non-combatants. The cargo ship Herald of Tomorrow has 43 children aboard, returning from a school trip to the Europa research stations. The passenger liner Golden Gate is carrying 217 elderly humans to the medical facilities on Titan. The mining transport prospector's Dream has 37 families whose only crime was choosing to build a life in the asteroid belt. Kethvar's hands clenched and unclenched in a rhythm that indicated extreme psychological stress. The Confederation had rules about civilian casualties, protocols that had been established over millennia to maintain the moral authority that justified their dominion over lesser species. Firing on obvious non-combatants would violate fundamental principles that held their political alliance together. You cannot seriously expect us to believe that your civilians volunteered for this suicide mission, the ambassador declared, but there was uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Suicide mission? Sarah's laugh was genuine, filled with the dark humor that sustained humans through impossible situations. Ambassador, let me tell you about the cargo ship Darwin's Legacy, currently positioned 3,000 kilometers off your starboard flank. She activated another channel, and suddenly, the bridge of a civilian cargo vessel appeared on the secondary screen. The captain was a weathered woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, standing beside a bridge crew that included 2 teenagers and an elderly man who could have been anyone's grandfather. "This is Captain Maria Santos of the Darwin's Legacy," the woman said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine cargo deliveries. "We're hauling 70 tons of medical supplies to the Ganymede colonies, and we've got my granddaughter and her school robotics team aboard for the ride." One of the teenagers waved at the camera with the casual fearlessness that only adolescents could manage. "Hi, we're the Martian Academy Engineering Club, and we've been working on defensive drone prototypes. Want to see what we built?" Ambassador Kethvar stared at the screen in complete bewilderment. In 3 centuries of diplomatic service, he had never encountered civilians who treated an imminent military engagement as an opportunity to demonstrate school projects. "I don't understand," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would your civilians deliberately place themselves in danger? Why would parents bring their children into a combat zone? This behavior is not logical for a survival-oriented species." Captain Chen's expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been sympathy for a being who genuinely couldn't comprehend what he was witnessing. "Ambassador, that's the fundamental difference between your species and mine. Your people follow orders from authority because that's how your society functions. Our people make their own choices, and they've chosen to stand between you and the thing they refuse to lose." She gestured toward Earth, where the blue marble hung against the star field like a jewel worth any price. "Every human down there, every family in those ships, every person working in our colonies has something your confederation apparently doesn't understand. We have something worth fighting for that belongs to us, not because some council decided we could have it, but because we built it ourselves." Fleet Commander Zarthek approached Ambassador Kethvar with the careful steps of a warrior delivering unwelcome intelligence. "Sir, our battle analysis AI has completed its tactical assessment. The civilian vessel positions would result in massive non-combatant casualties in any direct assault scenario. The political ramifications would be severe." Kethvar's 6 eyes closed in what his species recognized as a gesture of profound frustration. "And if we attempt to maneuver around the civilian positions? The human military vessels would have multiple opportunities to engage us while we're executing complex formation changes. Their hidden weapons platforms are positioned to exploit exactly that kind of tactical vulnerability." The ambassador opened his eyes and stared at Captain Chun with what she was beginning to recognize as a mixture of respect and complete bewilderment. "You have maneuvered us into a position where we cannot achieve our objectives without violating our own laws and codes of conduct." Sarah's smile became genuinely warm for the first time since the conversation began. "Ambassador, welcome to humanity. We're the species that figured out how to make rules work for us instead of against us. The thing is, we didn't break any of your laws. We just arranged things so that following your standard procedures would force you to become the kind of people you claim you're not." She leaned back in her command chair, the gesture of someone who had just played their strongest card and was confident in the outcome. "So what's it going to be? Are you going to murder children to prove your authority? Or are you going to accept that maybe, just maybe, there are species in this galaxy that don't need the Confederation's version of civilization?" The silence that followed was broken only by the quiet hum of ship systems and the soft background chatter of crews preparing for whatever would come next. Across the Sol system, millions of humans waited to see whether their gamble had paid off or if they had just signed their own death warrants. Ambassador Kethvar stared at the tactical display showing his fleet surrounded by defensive positions, civilian vessels, and a level of coordinated resistance that his species' most pessimistic projections hadn't anticipated. For the first time in his long career, he was beginning to understand that there might be problems that couldn't be solved with superior firepower and ancient authority. The moment of truth arrived when a junior communications officer aboard Ambassador Kethvar's flagship made the mistake that would change everything. Overwhelmed by the tactical complexity and frustrated by his species' inability to understand human behavior, Junior Tactical Analyst Veldar activated a targeting scanner directed at one of the civilian vessels. The scan lasted exactly 2.7 seconds before every human weapons platform in the system locked onto his ship. Captain Chen felt the familiar cold rage that had earned her a reputation among pirates and warlords throughout human space. The targeting scan had been directed at the passenger liner Grandmother's Legacy, a converted transport carrying 147 elderly humans to medical facilities on Titan. "That was a mistake," she said, her voice carrying the deadly quiet that her crew recognized as a prelude to violence. On the Confederation flagship, alarms began screaming as defensive systems registered the sudden acquisition of hundreds of targeting locks. Fleet Commander Zarthek's predatory instincts kicked into overdrive as his tactical displays lit up like a festival celebration, each indicator representing a weapon system capable of reducing his ship to component atoms. "Sir," his weapons officer called out, his voice cracking with stress. "We have multiple target locks from across the system. Energy signatures are spiking on platforms we didn't even know existed." Ambassador Kethvar turned toward his military commander with the slow precision of someone whose worldview was undergoing fundamental restructuring. "Explain what just occurred." Junior Analyst Veldar initiated an active sensor sweep of one of their civilian vessels. The humans interpreted this as a targeting action and responded with. Zarthek paused, checking his displays again to make sure he was reading the numbers correctly. "With approximately 800 simultaneous targeting acquisitions of our flagship." The bridge fell silent except for the continuing alarm systems and the rapid clicking of Veldar's nervous breathing apparatus. Every being present understood that they had just crossed a line that the humans had drawn in invisible ink across the entire solar system. Captain Chen's voice cut through the tension like a fusion torch through hull plating. "Ambassador, you have exactly 30 seconds to power down that targeting system and issue a formal apology to the captain of the Grandmother's Legacy. After that, my people are going to assume that you've decided to open hostilities, and we're going to respond accordingly." "This is outrageous," Kethvar declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "A simple sensor sweep is not an act of aggression under any civilized rules of engagement." 25 seconds, Sarah responded, her tone suggesting that she was counting down to something far more permanent than diplomatic consequences. Throughout the human fleet, weapons that had been hidden for years began charging to full power. The disguised mining platforms revealed particle beam arrays that could punch through military-grade armor. The Q-ships deployed missile pods that had been concealed within their civilian hulls. Even the automated defense platforms began broadcasting targeting data that showed they could coordinate strikes with mathematical precision. 15 seconds. Fleet Commander Zarthek made the decision that probably saved both fleets from mutual annihilation. Without waiting for ambassador approval, he strode to the junior analyst station and manually shut down the targeting system before broadcasting an immediate stand-down order to his entire fleet. "Targeting systems offline," he announced, his warrior's pragmatism overriding diplomatic protocol. "All weapon systems returning to standby status." The alarm sounds faded, replaced by the tense silence of beings who had just avoided a catastrophe that would have echoed across the galaxy. Captain Chun checked her tactical displays, confirming that the Confederation fleet was indeed powering down their aggressive systems. "Apology," she prompted. Ambassador Kethvar's elongated features contorted with an expression that his species used to indicate profound internal conflict. Everything in his 3 centuries of experience told him that backing down from primitive species set dangerous precedents. But the tactical reality was undeniable. His fleet was surrounded, outmaneuvered, and facing levels of coordinated resistance that turned their numerical superiority into a potential death trap. "This is Ambassador Kethvar to the vessel Grandmother's Legacy," he said finally, each word extracted like a painful tooth. The Confederation extends its regrets for the inappropriate sensor activity directed toward your vessel. It was not intended as a threatening action. On the secondary screen, the elderly captain of the passenger liner appeared, her white hair perfectly arranged despite the circumstances, and her eyes holding the kind of sharp intelligence that had guided humanity through countless crises. "Apology accepted, Ambassador," Captain Elena Rodriguez said with the gracious politeness that only someone who had just survived a targeting lock could manage. "Though I do hope your young officers learn better manners before their next diplomatic mission." The rebuke was delivered with such gentle courtesy that it somehow managed to be more devastating than any military threat. Across the bridge of the Confederation flagship, every being present understood that they had just been scolded by an elderly human grandmother who treated their most advanced weapons systems as a minor inconvenience. Captain Chun allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before addressing the larger strategic situation. "Now that we've established the rules of engagement, Ambassador, perhaps we can discuss the actual problem here." "The problem," Kethvar replied with forced dignity, "is your species' refusal to acknowledge legitimate galactic authority and submit to proper oversight." Sarah's laugh contained no humor whatsoever. "No, Ambassador. The problem is that your Galactic Confederation has existed for so long without being challenged that you've forgotten the difference between authority and consent." She gestured toward her tactical display, where the positions of both fleets were highlighted against the backdrop of human civilization. Every single government, every colony, every space station in this system exists because human beings chose to build it. We didn't ask for permission, we didn't submit applications to some galactic bureaucracy, and we certainly didn't agree to hand over our sovereignty to beings we'd never met. Civilized species do not simply claim territory without proper authorization, Kethvar protested. The Confederation exists to prevent exactly this kind of chaotic expansion. Chaotic expansion? Sarah's voice carried the edge that made veteran Marines check their weapons and junior officers review their life insurance policies. "Ambassador, let me tell you about chaotic expansion. Chaotic expansion is when a species spreads through space by conquering other people and forcing them to accept your version of civilization. Chaotic expansion is showing up in someone else's solar system with 300 warships and demanding they surrender their freedom because your paperwork says they should." She stood up from her command chair, her posture radiating the kind of controlled fury that came from protecting something irreplaceable. "What we did was build a civilization based on the radical idea that people should be free to make their own choices, succeed through their own efforts, and take responsibility for their own mistakes. We spread to the stars not to conquer other species, but because we refuse to be trapped in a single system when the universe offers so much room to grow." Fleet Commander Zarthek found himself nodding slightly, his warrior's instincts recognizing something fundamental in the human captain's words. His own species had earned their place in the Confederation through military prowess, but they had also sacrificed much of their independence in exchange for the security of membership. "Your words suggest that you believe your way of life is superior to galactic civilization," Ambassador Kethvar said carefully, as if testing the waters of a concept he couldn't quite grasp. "Not superior," Sarah replied, her voice softening slightly. "Just ours. Ambassador, the Confederation has maintained order by requiring all species to follow the same rules, think the same way, and accept the same limitations. That might work for people who value security over freedom, but it doesn't work for us." She gestured toward Earth, where the lights of cities created a gentle glow against the planet's night side. "Every human down there is descended from people who left somewhere else because they wanted something different. We came to the stars for the same reason our ancestors crossed oceans, climbed mountains, and explored continents. Not because someone gave us permission, but because it never occurred to us that we needed permission to be free." The communication channel carried the sound of her breathing for a moment as she gathered her thoughts. When she continued, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "So here's what's going to happen, Ambassador. Your fleet is going to leave our solar system and return to Confederation space. You're going to report that humanity declines membership in your organization, but is willing to establish trade and diplomatic relations as an independent species. And if the Confederation decides that's not acceptable, she smiled the cold smile that had made pirate captains surrender without a fight and caused hardened Marines to request transfers to safer postings. Well, Ambassador, you've seen what humans do when someone threatens our freedom. I'd strongly suggest that your people find something more productive to do with their time than learning just how creative we can get when we're properly motivated. The bridge of the Confederation flagship fell into complete silence as every being present contemplated the implications of what they had just witnessed. For the first time in millennia, a primitive species had not only refused to submit to Confederation authority, but had demonstrated the capability to make that refusal stick through force of arms. Ambassador Kethvar stared at Captain Chun for a long moment, his 6 eyes reflecting the kind of thoughtful consideration that came from encountering something entirely outside his experience. Finally, he spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing his words very carefully indeed. Captain Chun, you have presented us with a situation that requires careful consideration by the full Confederation Council. I will need time to consult with my superiors before making any final decisions regarding your species' status. Sarah nodded, recognizing the diplomatic language for what it was, a face-saving way to withdraw without admitting defeat. Of course, Ambassador. Take all the time you need. But while you're consulting with your council, I'd suggest you also consult with your intelligence services about what happens to people who threaten human freedom twice. The threat was delivered with such casual politeness that it took several seconds for its full implications to register. When they did, every military officer on the Confederation flagship began running calculations about what a species this tactically creative might accomplish if they decided to take the offensive. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Chun stood in the observation deck of the newly commissioned UES Constitution, watching the diplomatic convoy from the Galactic Confederation approach Earth orbit. The escort was considerably smaller this time, consisting of only 12 vessels flying under diplomatic flags and broadcasting friendship codes on every available frequency. They're certainly being more polite this round, Admiral Harrison commented, joining her at the panoramic viewport that offered an unobstructed view of Earth and the surrounding space infrastructure. The past 6 months had seen an explosion of construction as humanity prepared for whatever the galaxy might bring next. Sarah smiled, noting the way the Confederation ships maintained respectful distances from human installations and requested permission for every course correction. Amazing what shooting at someone's flagship does for their diplomatic manners. The aftermath of what historians were already calling the Soul Confrontation had rippled through the galaxy in ways that no one had anticipated. Ambassador Kethvar's report to the Confederation Council had triggered the most intensive debate in their recorded history, with member species arguing for months about how to respond to humanity's unprecedented rejection of their authority. Ma'am, incoming transmission from the lead diplomatic vessel, Communications Officer Torres announced. His promotion to senior staff had come with the general reorganization that followed humanity's sudden emergence as a galactic power that couldn't be ignored. Put it through main display. The view screen revealed Ambassador Kethvar, but the towering alien bore little resemblance to the supremely confident being who had arrived 6 months earlier with demands and ultimatums. His 4 arms moved in gestures that Sarah's cultural briefings identified as indicating respect and cautious optimism. Captain Chun, I bring greetings from the Galactic Confederation Council and a formal proposal for establishing diplomatic relations between our civilizations. He began, his voice carrying none of the condescending authority that had characterized their first encounter. Ambassador, Sarah replied with the professional courtesy appropriate to someone representing 8 billion humans who had proven they weren't interested in being conquered. We're prepared to hear your proposal. Kethvar's 6 eyes reflected something that might have been embarrassment. The Council has spent considerable time reviewing the events of our previous meeting. After extensive deliberation, we have concluded that humanity's desire for independence is not incompatible with peaceful coexistence in this galaxy. Admiral Harrison raised an eyebrow. That's a diplomatic way of saying they decided not to start a war they weren't sure they could win. The Confederation hereby recognizes humanity as a sovereign species with full rights to self-governance within your established territories. The ambassador continued. We propose the establishment of formal diplomatic relations, including trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and mutual defense provisions. Sarah exchanged glances with Harrison before responding. That's a very different position from your previous visit, Ambassador. What changed the Council's mind? The alien's posture shifted in a way that his species used to indicate complex emotions. Captain, your species demonstrated something that the Confederation had not encountered in over a millennium. You showed us that it is possible for a people to choose their own destiny rather than simply accepting the destiny that others choose for them. He gestured with two of his four arms, a movement that indicated philosophical reflection among his people. The Council's deliberations revealed that many member species joined the Confederation not out of genuine desire for our particular form of civilization, but because they believed they had no alternative. Your successful resistance has caused many of our members to reconsider whether their association with us represents their true preferences or merely the path of least resistance. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. You're saying that our refusal to submit has inspired other species to question their own membership in the Confederation. 17 member species have formally requested renegotiation of their membership terms, HFY confirmed. 3 others have withdrawn from the Confederation entirely and declared independence. The political structure that has maintained galactic order for 10,000 years is undergoing fundamental changes because one primitive species refused to acknowledge our authority. The implications hit her like a fusion torpedo to the brain. Humanity hadn't just defended their own freedom. They had accidentally triggered a galaxy-wide independence movement among species who had forgotten that submission to authority was supposed to be a choice rather than an inevitability. I see, she said carefully. And how does the Council feel about these developments? Ambassador Kethvar's expression shifted to something that his species used to indicate ironic amusement. The Council is discovering that governing beings who actually want to be governed is considerably more pleasant than maintaining control over species who submit only because they fear the alternatives. Your rebellion has forced us to become a better organization. Admiral Harrison leaned forward slightly. So this diplomatic mission is about more than just recognizing our independence. Indeed, the Confederation wishes to propose humanity as a founding member of what we are tentatively calling the Galactic Alliance of Free Peoples, an organization based on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed authority, with membership contingent on mutual benefit rather than superior firepower. Sarah blinked. You want us to help you rebuild your entire governmental structure. Captain, your species has demonstrated mastery of principles that we had forgotten were possible. The ability to coordinate complex operations through voluntary cooperation rather than hierarchical command. The willingness of individuals to risk themselves for collective benefit without being ordered to do so. The tactical innovation that comes from people who think for themselves rather than simply following established procedures. Kethvar's 6 eyes focused on her with something approaching respect. The Council believes that humanity's participation would be essential to creating a galactic community based on consent rather than conquest. The observation deck fell silent as both humans processed the magnitude of what they were hearing. In defending their own independence, they had somehow become the catalyst for the largest political transformation in galactic history. There is, however, one condition that the Council considers non-negotiable, the ambassador added. And what's that? Sarah asked, her instincts warning her that the other shoe was about to drop. Your species must agree never again to demonstrate the tactical innovations you employed during the sole confrontation against fellow Alliance members. Several Council members had nightmares for weeks after studying your defensive strategies. Admiral Harrison's laugh echoed through the observation deck. Ambassador, are you asking us to promise not to embarrass your military commanders if they threaten us again? In essence, yes. The Council finds your creative approach to warfare both admirable and terrifying. We would prefer that such innovations be directed toward external threats rather than internal politics. Sarah smiled, the genuine expression of someone who had just realized that the galaxy's most powerful political organization was admitting that humans scared them. Ambassador, we can promise that as long as Alliance members respect our sovereignty and don't point weapons at our civilians, they'll never have to experience what you call our tactical innovations. That is acceptable to the Council. In that case, she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of agreement, I think we have the foundation for a very interesting diplomatic relationship. Ambassador Kethvar stared at the offered hand for a moment before carefully extending one of his forearms to clasp it. Captain, I believe your species is going to change this galaxy in ways that none of us can imagine. Ambassador, Sarah replied, her smile becoming the warm expression of someone who had just realized that the future was going to be far more interesting than anyone had planned. That's exactly what we do best. Outside the viewport, Earth turned slowly in its ancient orbit around the sun, its blue oceans and white clouds reflecting the light of the star that had given birth to a species too stubborn to accept that freedom was something other people had to give them permission to have. Around the planet, the lights of orbital stations and passing ships created a web of civilization that stretched out toward the asteroid belt and beyond, carrying with it the revolutionary idea that beings should be free to choose their own destinies among the stars. In the months that followed, as the Galactic Alliance of Free Peoples took shape around principles of voluntary cooperation and mutual respect, historians would mark the sole confrontation as the moment when the galaxy learned something that humanity had always known. Freedom wasn't something you asked for permission to have. It was something you built yourself, defended with everything you had, and shared with anyone brave enough to reach for it. Ambassador Kethvar would later write in his memoirs that meeting humanity taught the Confederation the difference between ruling through fear and leading through inspiration. Captain Sarah Chun never wrote memoirs, but her tactical innovations became required study at every military academy in the Alliance, with special emphasis on the principle that had defined humanity's approach to the galaxy from the beginning. When someone threatens your freedom, you don't just fight back. You fight back so effectively that they never want to threaten anyone's freedom again. The galaxy, as it turned out, was big enough for everyone to be free. It just took one species stubborn enough to prove it.